Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Ashern Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. I was around 12 or 13 years old when something happened that I still can't fully explain. It wasn't the kind of experience that completely changed my life, and I don't claim it was anything supernatural. Even after all these years, I've tried to find a logical explanation for it. But no matter how many times I replay it in my mind, one part of that afternoon has never made sense to me. It happened during the summer while I was home alone. My parents had gone out for a few hours, and I had the entire house to myself. Back then, being home alone felt like a little bit of freedom. I could watch whatever I wanted on TV, play video games without anyone interrupting me, and just relax until my family came back. The house was completely quiet, except for the sound of cartoons playing in the living room. I remember settling into my favorite chair, a fairly new recliner we had recently bought. It was one of those oversized, overstuffed, lazy-boy-style chairs that almost swallowed you when you sat down. It was incredibly comfortable, and everyone in the family liked using it because it was softer than any other seat in the house. That afternoon, it was all mine. I stretched out in the chair with my left leg hanging casually over the armrest while holding my Game Boy in both hands. The television was on in front of me, but I wasn't paying much attention to it because I was more focused on the game I was playing. Every now and then, I gently rocked the recliner back and forth without even thinking about it. It wasn't aggressive rocking or anything that would normally make a chair unstable. It was just the slow, natural movement people make when they're relaxing. Everything felt completely normal. Outside, it was a typical summer afternoon. I remember the weather being warm, maybe even a little uncomfortable because our air conditioner had been giving us problems for several days. If I remember correctly, it wasn't working at all anymore. The house felt warmer than usual, and everyone had been complaining about it. That's why the next part has always confused me. Without any warning, I suddenly felt an icy chill. It wasn't a cool breeze drifting through the room. It wasn't the feeling you get when someone opens a door or a window. It was a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to appear out of nowhere. One second I was warm. The next second, it felt like every bit of heat had disappeared around me. The cold washed over my entire body so quickly that every hair on my arms stood up. It wasn't just something I noticed physically. The feeling carried an odd sense of uneasiness that I still have trouble describing. The room suddenly felt different. Not darker, not quieter. Just wrong. I looked up from my Game Boy, confused about where the cold had come from. The television was still playing cartoons. Nothing had changed. There were no open windows. The curtains weren't moving. The air conditioner certainly wasn't working. For a brief moment, I just sat there trying to make sense of it. Then, everything happened at once. Without any warning at all, I was suddenly thrown forward out of the recliner. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. The chair lurched violently, and before I could catch myself, I was flying toward the floor. A split second later, the entire recliner tipped completely forward. The heavy chair crashed down directly on top of me. For a few moments, I just lay there underneath it, completely stunned. I wasn't seriously injured, but I was shocked. The whole thing had happened so suddenly that I couldn't immediately understand what had just occurred. After catching my breath, I pushed the chair off myself and slowly stood up. The living room looked exactly the same as it had only seconds before. The television continued playing. Nothing else had fallen over. Nothing else had moved. It was as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I stood there, staring at the recliner, trying to figure out how it could have tipped over so violently. My first thought was that something inside the chair must have broken. Since it was still fairly new, I assumed the reclining mechanism had somehow malfunctioned. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. After all, mechanical things fail sometimes. Maybe one of the internal parts snapped. Maybe the locking mechanism released unexpectedly. Maybe I had unknowingly leaned too far forward. There had to be a logical reason. The only thing that bothered me was the way it happened. I hadn't been rocking hard. I wasn't bouncing around like an excited kid. I wasn't throwing my weight backward and forward. I had only been gently rocking, the same way anyone naturally would while relaxing in a recliner. Nothing about what I was doing should have caused the chair to launch me onto the floor. Even so, I convinced myself that it must have been a mechanical problem. It was easier to believe that than anything else. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that freezing cold feeling that had happened only moments before. The chill came first. Then the chair tipped over. Those two moments became permanently connected in my memory. Whether they were actually related or not, I have no way of knowing. But every time I remembered one, I immediately remembered the other. After that afternoon, I completely avoided that recliner. Even after someone stood it back up and confirmed it seemed perfectly fine, I refused to sit in it again. Whenever my parents watched television, they used it without any problems. Guests sat in it. Nothing happened. The chair never tipped over again. As far as anyone else knew, it worked perfectly. I never saw it malfunction another single time. That somehow made the whole experience even stranger. If the chair had actually been broken, you would expect it to happen again eventually. But it never did. For years, I chose any other seat in the house before I would even consider sitting in that recliner. My family occasionally asked why I always avoided it. I usually shrugged and said I just preferred another chair. I never felt like trying to explain what had happened because I wasn't even sure I understood it myself. As time passed, life moved on. Eventually, we got rid of the recliner and replaced it with different furniture. But even though the chair disappeared, the memory stayed with me. I've spent countless hours over the years trying to figure out exactly what happened that afternoon. Maybe my memory isn't completely accurate. After all, I was only a kid. Maybe I accidentally shifted my weight without realizing it. Maybe I pushed against the floor harder than I remember. Maybe the recliner really did have a hidden defect that somehow fixed itself afterward. Those explanations all sound reasonable. In fact, I hope one of them is true. But there's still one part I can't explain. That sudden wave of freezing cold. Even now, I can remember exactly how it felt. The room had been warm all day. The air conditioner wasn't working. There was no obvious reason for such an intense drop in temperature. Yet I felt it as clearly as I remember being thrown onto the floor. Over the years, I've experienced something else that occasionally reminds me of that afternoon. Every once in a while, usually when I'm completely alone, I'll suddenly get the overwhelming feeling that someone is watching me. It's hard to explain because I never actually see anyone. I don't hear footsteps. I don't hear voices. Nothing moves around me. There's simply this strange feeling that another presence is somewhere nearby, just outside my view. Whenever it happens, I automatically look around the room. Every single time, there's nobody there. The feeling usually fades after a few moments, but while it's happening, it's incredibly uncomfortable. I've experienced that sensation several times throughout my life. It's unsettling every time. But it has never developed into anything more. Nothing has ever moved. I've never seen a shadow figure. I've never witnessed objects flying across a room. I've never heard unexplained voices. Most importantly, I've never experienced another physical event remotely similar to what happened with that recliner. That afternoon remains completely unique. I've told the story to a few people over the years, and almost everyone offers the same explanation. They say it must have been the chair. They say I probably lost my balance. They say childhood memories aren't always reliable. Honestly, I don't disagree with them. Those are probably the most logical answers. I don't claim to know what actually happened. Maybe it really was nothing more than a faulty piece of furniture and a coincidence. Maybe my memory has exaggerated certain details over time. I fully accept that's possible. But whenever I think back to that day, one memory stands out more clearly than anything else. I remember sitting alone in a warm house, watching cartoons while playing my Game Boy. I remember gently rocking back and forth in a brand new recliner. I remember feeling an impossible wave of icy cold wash over me. And I remember being violently thrown onto the floor as the heavy chair crashed down on top of me. Whether it was a mechanical failure, an unbelievable coincidence, or something I'll never fully understand, it's still the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. Nothing before it has ever come close, and thankfully, nothing since then ever has. Years ago, I lived in a house that was completely isolated from everything else. The nearest town was several miles away, and once you left the main road, there was nothing but trees for what seemed like forever. The house sat right in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by towering pines and thick undergrowth. During the day, it was peaceful and beautiful. At night, though, it felt like an entirely different place. When darkness settled over the woods, everything became incredibly quiet. There were no nearby neighbors, no streetlights, and almost no signs of civilization. The only sounds you usually heard were insects, the wind moving through the trees, or the occasional call of an owl somewhere deep in the forest. Living there meant getting used to the silence. But even after spending years in that house, there were still nights when the darkness outside felt unsettling. One particular night has stayed with me ever since. It happened many years ago while I was still living there with my parents. It was late at night, and the entire house was asleep. My parents had gone to bed hours earlier, and I remember everything feeling unusually calm. At some point, I found myself outside. Even now, I can't remember exactly why I was there. In the dream, it felt perfectly normal. I wasn't questioning anything. I simply remember standing outside the house, surrounded by the endless forest that stretched into complete darkness. The air was cool. The trees stood perfectly still. The night was almost completely silent. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then I noticed movement. Somewhere between the trees, a massive black shape suddenly appeared. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. It looked much larger than any dog. It wasn't shaped quite like a bear either. The darkness made it impossible to identify. All I knew was that it was big, very big. Before I could process what I was looking at, the animal suddenly started running directly toward me. The speed was unbelievable. One moment it was standing among the trees. The next, it was charging straight at me with terrifying force. Every instinct inside me exploded into panic. Without thinking, I turned around and ran. I sprinted toward the house as fast as I possibly could. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was reaching the front door before whatever was chasing me caught up. The distance felt much longer than it actually was. Every step seemed painfully slow. I could almost feel the creature getting closer behind me, even though I never turned around to see it. My heart was pounding. My breathing became frantic. Pure adrenaline took over. Somehow, I reached the front door. I grabbed the handle, rushed inside, and slammed the door shut behind me. Without wasting a second, I locked it. For a brief moment, I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. I remember standing completely still, listening. The silence inside the house felt almost as frightening as whatever had been outside. Then another thought suddenly hit me. We had another door. It was on the opposite side of the house. In my mind, I suddenly became convinced that it was still unlocked. An overwhelming feeling of panic rushed over me again. If that door was open, whatever had chased me could come inside. Without hesitation, I pushed away from the front door and ran through the house as fast as I could. The hallway seemed much longer than normal. Every room was dark. The house felt strangely unfamiliar, despite being my own home. I could hear my own footsteps echoing as I raced toward the second entrance. The fear became almost unbearable. I was convinced I had only seconds left. When I reached the other side of the house, I saw exactly what I had feared. The second door was open. Cold darkness stretched beyond the doorway. For one horrifying moment, I froze. It felt as though whatever had been chasing me could appear through that opening at any second. I lunged toward the door, desperate to slam it shut before it was too late. Just as I reached for it, I woke up. My eyes flew open. I was lying in my own bed. For several seconds, I had absolutely no idea where I was. My heart was racing so hard that I could hear it pounding in my ears. I was breathing heavily, almost gasping for air. The room around me was dark, but it was the familiar darkness of my bedroom. It took a few moments before I fully realized that none of it had actually happened. It had all been a dream. Even after understanding that, my body refused to calm down. The adrenaline was completely real. It felt exactly as though I had actually sprinted across the yard and through the house. My muscles were tense. My chest hurt from breathing so hard. Then I noticed something even stranger. There was a tingling sensation spreading across my back. It felt almost as though every nerve was awake. The feeling wasn't painful. It was just incredibly vivid. For several minutes, I lay there trying to slow my breathing while convincing myself that I was safe. Eventually, my heartbeat returned to normal. The tingling slowly faded. The room became quiet again. But the memory of the dream stayed with me. I've had plenty of dreams throughout my life. Most of them disappear within minutes of waking up. This one never did. What fascinates me most isn't the creature itself. I still couldn't describe exactly what it looked like. I only remember that it was enormous, completely black, and running toward me with terrifying speed. What really stayed with me was how convincing everything felt. While I was dreaming, there wasn't a single moment where I questioned whether it was real. My brain accepted every detail without hesitation. The cold night air, the forest, the panic, the desperate sprint back to the house, the overwhelming need to lock every door before it was too late. Every emotion felt completely genuine. Even after waking up, my body reacted as though I had actually survived something. The adrenaline wasn't imaginary. My racing heartbeat wasn't imaginary. The tingling across my back wasn't imaginary. Those physical reactions were absolutely real. That's what amazes me about dreams. Your brain can create an experience so convincing that your body responds exactly as if you're living through it. Your heart races. Your breathing changes. Your muscles tighten. You wake up carrying the fear with you, even after your mind realizes there was never any real danger. I've had nightmares since then, but none have matched the intensity of that one. Nothing has ever recreated that overwhelming feeling of running for my life through complete darkness, while believing something was only seconds behind me. Even now, years later, I can still remember every part of it with incredible clarity. Sometimes people say dreams aren't real. They're right, of course. But while you're inside one, your brain doesn't know the difference. For those few terrifying moments, that creature, that forest, and that desperate race to lock the doors felt every bit as real as waking life. And that's what makes the experience so unforgettable. Years ago, my family lived in a house that always felt wrong. I can't really explain it any better than that. From the outside, it looked like a perfectly ordinary two-story home. But there was something about the atmosphere inside that constantly made me feel uneasy. Even during the daytime, certain rooms felt strangely uncomfortable. And at night, the entire house seemed to take on a completely different personality. It wasn't because the house was old or falling apart. It was actually in decent condition. Still, there was this constant feeling that someone else was there, even when you knew you were completely alone. At first, I assumed it was just my imagination. Everyone gets creeped out by unfamiliar noises in a quiet house. Floors settle, pipes make strange sounds, and trees brushing against windows can create all kinds of unsettling noises. I tried to convince myself that was all it was. But no matter how many logical explanations I came up with, I never completely felt comfortable there. One particular night stands out more than anything else. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I remember waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. It wasn't like waking up naturally after a good night's sleep. It felt as though something had pulled me awake. One moment, I was sleeping peacefully. The next, my eyes were wide open. I wasn't startled by a loud noise. Nobody had called my name. There wasn't any obvious reason for me to wake up. I simply opened my eyes with the strange feeling that I needed to look outside. Even now, I can't explain why I felt that urge. It was almost as if something had directed my attention toward the window. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, and the window overlooked our backyard. Still half asleep, I slowly climbed out of bed and walked toward the window. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight coming through the glass. For a few seconds, I just stood there looking out into the yard. Everything seemed completely normal. The backyard was quiet. The trees barely moved. There wasn't anyone outside. Then I looked down toward the ground directly below my window. Standing near the edge of the backyard was an old woman. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking around. She was simply standing there, looking directly up at me. At first, my brain struggled to understand what I was seeing. It made no sense. It was the middle of the night. Our house wasn't close to any neighbors. There was absolutely no reason for an elderly woman to be standing alone in our backyard. The longer I looked at her, the more unsettling she became. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't calling for help. She wasn't trying to get anyone's attention. She was simply staring at me. Her face carried the most disturbing expression I have ever seen. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even ordinary hatred. There was something deeply unsettling about the way she looked at me. Her expression felt completely unnatural, almost impossible to describe. The only word I've ever been able to use for it is sinister. It felt cold, empty, almost inhuman. I remember thinking that she didn't look like a normal person at all. As strange as it sounds, the thought immediately entered my mind that I wasn't looking at an ordinary elderly woman. In that moment, she felt more like something pretending to be one. I know how unbelievable that sounds. Even today, I hesitate to tell the story because I realize how impossible it seems. But that's exactly how I felt while looking at her. There was something about her presence that filled me with absolute dread. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She never looked away. She never moved. She simply continued staring directly at me. The strangest part wasn't even seeing her. It was the overwhelming feeling that somehow she had caused me to wake up. I know that doesn't make logical sense. I can't explain it. But even in that moment, I had this powerful feeling that I hadn't woken up by accident. It felt as though she had somehow drawn my attention to the window, almost as if she wanted me to see her. That thought terrified me even more than her appearance. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, although it was probably only a few seconds. My heart was racing. Every instinct told me to step away from the window. Finally, I forced myself to move. I quickly backed away and refused to look outside again. I climbed back into bed, pulled the blanket over myself like every frightened kid does, and lay there listening to the silence. I don't remember falling asleep again. I only remember waiting for morning. The next day, I tried convincing myself that I'd dreamed the entire thing. Maybe I had still been half asleep. Maybe my eyes had mistaken a tree or a shadow for a person. The human brain can create convincing illusions when you're tired. That's what I kept telling myself. But no explanation ever felt completely right. The image of that woman's face stayed with me for years. It wasn't just what she looked like. It was the feeling that came with seeing her. I've had nightmares before. I've been startled by strangers. I've seen unsettling things in horror movies. None of those experiences felt remotely similar. This carried a kind of fear that's difficult to describe. It felt deeply personal, almost as though I had interrupted something that wasn't meant to be seen. As time went on, I began noticing that I wasn't the only one who felt uncomfortable in that house. Nobody ever claimed to see ghosts or strange figures, but everyone seemed to agree that the place had an unusually heavy atmosphere. Certain rooms always felt colder than others. Sometimes the house seemed far quieter than it should have been. There was always this strange feeling that you weren't completely alone. Of course, there could be perfectly ordinary explanations for all of it. Old houses make strange noises. Isolation can affect the way people feel. When one person mentions something unusual, others often begin noticing ordinary things more closely. I've thought about all those possibilities many times. Even so, that night remains impossible for me to explain. Years later, my family finally moved away. The difference was immediate. The uncomfortable feeling we'd lived with for so long simply disappeared. Our new home felt normal, peaceful, comfortable. For the first time in a long while, I stopped feeling uneasy every time night came around. Looking back now, I'm incredibly grateful that we no longer live in that house. Whether what I saw was the result of a vivid, half-asleep hallucination, a trick of the darkness, or something I'll never truly understand, I honestly can't say. I don't claim to know what it was. I only know what I experienced. I remember waking up for no apparent reason. I remember walking to the second-floor window. I remember looking down into the backyard. And I remember an old woman standing there, staring directly at me with the most sinister expression I have ever seen. No matter how many years pass, that's one image I don't think I'll ever forget. I was 15 years old when something happened that I still think about from time to time. Even now, years later, I can't say for certain what really happened. I've gone over every possible explanation in my mind, but none of them completely fit. Whether it was a trick of my exhausted mind, an unusually vivid experience, or something I'll never understand, I honestly don't know. At the time, my older brother and I had traveled to visit our grandparents, who lived in a small countryside house far away from the city. Their home was surrounded by open fields, dirt roads, and patches of thick woodland. It was a beautiful place during the day, peaceful and quiet, but it was also incredibly isolated. The nearest town was a long drive away, and cell phone reception in the area was almost non-existent. Once you left the main road, there were very few signs of civilization. We arrived in the afternoon and spent the first day relaxing with our grandparents. Everything was completely normal. We ate dinner together, talked for a while, and went to bed early because life in the countryside always seemed to move at a slower pace. The next morning was warm and sunny. After breakfast, I decided to go for a walk by myself. I was 15, and like most teenagers, I didn't think much about wandering off alone. I put on my headphones, started listening to music on my phone, and left the house without telling anyone exactly where I planned to go. At first, it was a great walk. The countryside was beautiful. Fresh air replaced the noise of the city, birds sang from the trees, and everything felt calm and peaceful. I wasn't paying much attention to where I was going, because I assumed I could easily find my way back. I simply followed one path after another while listening to music. Time passed much faster than I realized. Eventually, I looked up from my phone and stopped walking. Something didn't feel right. None of the paths looked familiar anymore. I turned around, expecting to recognize the way I'd come. I didn't. Every direction looked exactly the same. The dirt roads disappeared into fields and trees, and I couldn't remember which one I had originally followed. That's when I realized I was lost. At first, I wasn't too worried. I figured I had simply wandered farther than I intended. I chose what seemed like the most familiar path and started walking. After 15 minutes, nothing looked recognizable. I tried another direction. Still nothing. The longer I searched, the more confused I became. Hours seemed to pass. The afternoon slowly faded into evening. The bright sunlight turned orange as the sun dropped lower in the sky. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the map. There was no signal, not even a single bar. I walked a little farther, raising my phone into the air every few minutes, hoping reception would appear. Nothing. The countryside was completely silent except for the sound of insects and the occasional breeze moving through the grass. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, darkness began settling over everything. The peaceful landscape that had looked so beautiful earlier now felt completely different. Every tree became a dark silhouette. Every shadow looked deeper than it really was. The paths were difficult to see, and I could barely tell where I was going. Panic slowly started creeping in. I had no idea where I was. I couldn't call anyone. Nobody knew my exact location. I kept walking, hoping I would eventually recognize something. Instead, everything looked even more unfamiliar. The darkness made every direction seem identical. By that point, I was genuinely scared. I kept imagining all the things that could happen if I spent the entire night out there alone. The thought of wild animals crossed my mind. So did the possibility of falling into a ditch or getting even farther away from my grandparents' house. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was beating faster with every passing minute. Then I heard a voice. Hello. The word came from somewhere ahead of me. I stopped immediately. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it. Then I heard it again. Someone was definitely there. I quickly took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Standing a short distance away was a man. He looked to be fairly young, maybe somewhere in his 20s or early 30s. He was tall and well-dressed. He wore a plain white shirt with blue jeans, clothes that looked surprisingly clean considering we were out in the countryside after dark. His face seemed calm. When the light reached him, he smiled. Not a frightening smile, just a gentle, friendly smile. He looked directly at me and asked, "Why are you here? It's dangerous around here." His voice sounded calm and reassuring. I immediately explained that I had gotten lost. I told him I couldn't find my grandparents' house and that my phone had no signal. He listened quietly before smiling again. "It's okay," he said. "Come with me. I'll take you back home." Looking back now, I realize how dangerous it was to trust a complete stranger. Today, I would never make that decision. But I was only 15 years old. I was tired. It was dark. I was scared. And this seemed like the first friendly person I'd seen in hours, so I agreed. We started walking together. What I remember most is how little he spoke. He never asked my name. He never asked where exactly my grandparents lived. He never asked what I was doing out there. He simply walked beside me in complete silence. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I assumed he already knew the area well enough to recognize where I needed to go. The silence didn't seem unusual then. Now, when I think back on it, it feels strange. We walked together for what felt like several minutes. Neither of us said much. The only sounds were our footsteps and the insects hidden in the grass. Then, suddenly, I heard someone shouting my name. It was loud, very loud. I immediately recognized the voice. It was my older brother. I looked ahead and saw him running toward me as fast as he could. The moment I saw him, relief flooded through me. I ran straight toward him. He grabbed my shoulders and asked if I was okay. I could tell from his face that he'd been searching for me for quite some time. I quickly explained what had happened. I got lost, I said. But this guy helped me. My brother looked at me with complete confusion. What guy? I turned around and pointed behind me. There, except there wasn't anyone there anymore. The path behind us was completely empty. The man had disappeared. I looked in every direction. There were no nearby trees large enough to hide behind. No side paths. No sound of footsteps walking away. Nothing, he was simply gone. I remember feeling my stomach drop. Only seconds earlier, he'd been walking right beside me. Now there wasn't a single sign that anyone had ever been there. I looked back at my brother and insisted there had been a man with me. He frowned and shook his head. "I've been watching you," he said. "You were walking alone." At first, I thought he was joking. But he wasn't. He genuinely believed I had been by myself the entire time. I didn't know what to say. I knew what I'd seen. I knew I'd spoken to someone. I remembered hearing his voice. I remembered following him. Yet according to my brother, there had never been anyone beside me at all. The walk back to my grandparents' house felt much longer than it actually was. Neither of us talked very much. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man again. I never did. That night, I barely slept. I replayed every moment in my head. Could I have imagined him? Was I so tired and frightened that my mind created someone to help me? Had there actually been a real person who somehow disappeared before my brother arrived? I honestly couldn't answer those questions then, and I still can't answer them now. Years have passed since that day. I've thought about the experience countless times. The logical side of me says there was probably an explanation. Maybe stress, fear, exhaustion, and the darkness affected my memory. Maybe someone really did help me, and my brother simply didn't notice him. I honestly don't know. But one thing has always stayed with me. The man never asked a single question. Not my name, not where I lived, not who I was visiting. He simply appeared when I was lost, calmly told me to follow him, and silently walked beside me until the exact moment my brother found me. Then he was gone. Whatever really happened that evening, I was incredibly fortunate to make it home safely. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous it was for a 15-year-old to wander alone in an unfamiliar countryside without telling anyone where I was going. It was a mistake I never repeated. In fact, after that trip, I never wanted to visit my grandparents' countryside house again. The memory stayed with me long after we left. Even today, whenever I think about getting lost, that strange evening is the first thing that comes to mind. I still don't know who that man was. I don't know whether he was real, a trick of my exhausted mind, or something I'll never be able to explain. All I know is that I made it home safely that night, and for that, I'll always be grateful. I was 11 years old when something happened that I've never been able to fully explain. Even now, years later, I still don't know whether it was an unusually vivid nightmare, sleep paralysis, a dream that blended into reality, or something else entirely. Whatever it was, it's one of the most frightening experiences I've ever had. It all started with a recurring nightmare. For 3 nights in a row, I had exactly the same dream. Every time it began the same way. I would be lying in my bed, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My bedroom looked exactly as it did in real life. Nothing seemed different at first. The furniture was in the right places, the door was closed, and everything looked completely normal. Then I would notice something standing in my room. It wasn't a person. At least, it didn't feel like one. In my dream, I always described it as a demon because I couldn't think of any other word that matched the overwhelming fear it caused me. It was dark, human-shaped, and completely silent. It never spoke. It never rushed toward me. It simply stood there watching me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't look away from it. Every time I woke up from the nightmare, my heart was racing, and it took several minutes before I convinced myself that it had only been a dream. After the third night, the nightmares finally stopped. For weeks, everything went back to normal. I stopped thinking about the strange figure. Life continued like nothing had happened. About a month later, something happened that brought all those memories rushing back. It was the middle of the night. I don't know what time it was exactly, but the room was completely dark, except for a small amount of moonlight coming through the window. The house was silent, and everyone else was asleep. For no obvious reason, I suddenly woke up. At first, I stayed completely still half asleep, and trying to understand why I had opened my eyes. Then I saw it. Standing inside my room was the exact same figure from my nightmare. Every detail looked identical. It was standing in almost the same place I remembered from my dreams, silently facing my bed. For a moment, I couldn't move. I simply stared at it. It stared back. The first minute felt endless. Neither of us moved. The room was completely silent. The figure remained perfectly still, almost like a statue. I kept telling myself that I had to still be dreaming. There was no other explanation. I blinked several times, expecting it to disappear. It didn't. The second minute was even worse. As I continued staring, I noticed something that made my fear even stronger. It looked like the figure was breathing. Its body rose and fell slightly, just enough to make it seem alive. That tiny movement made everything feel far more real than any nightmare I'd ever had. I could feel my heart pounding against my chest. Every instinct told me to scream for my parents. But I couldn't. I remained frozen, staring back at whatever was standing there. The third minute passed painfully slowly. Without making any sound, the figure shifted slightly to its right. It wasn't a large movement, just enough that it seemed to adjust its position. The strange part was the way it moved. It almost looked as if it wanted a better view of me. The movement wasn't rushed. It wasn't aggressive. It was slow and deliberate. That somehow made it even more frightening. I watched every tiny motion, unable to convince myself that I was imagining it. By the fourth minute, I had become completely overwhelmed with fear. The figure hadn't come any closer, but something about its posture had changed. It looked almost as though it was preparing to move. The best way I've ever been able to describe it is that it seemed to be aiming toward me, not with a weapon, not in any obvious way, just focusing on me. Every second that passed felt longer than the last. I remember wondering whether it was about to come closer. I had never been so scared in my life. The fifth minute felt impossible. I realized I couldn't stay frozen forever. Whether I was awake, dreaming, or imagining everything, I needed to do something. I gathered every bit of courage I had. Then, as quickly as I could, I jumped out of bed. The instant I stood up, the figure disappeared. Not slowly, not by walking away. It was simply gone. One moment it had been standing there. The next, there was nothing. The room was completely empty. I looked around frantically. The corner where it had been standing was empty. The doorway was empty. There was nowhere it could have hidden. It had simply vanished. I turned on every light in my room. I checked behind the door. I looked inside the closet. I searched every corner, even though I already knew there couldn't possibly be anyone there. The room was exactly as it had always been. Nothing was out of place. Eventually, I convinced myself enough to get back into bed. I don't remember sleeping much for the rest of that night. Every little sound made me jump. Every shadow looked suspicious. I kept expecting the figure to appear again. It never did. The next morning, everything felt normal again. Sunlight filled the room, making it difficult to believe anything frightening had happened there just a few hours earlier. I tried explaining the experience, but it was difficult to put into words. Part of me wondered if I had experienced sleep paralysis or some other sleep-related phenomenon. I've read about people waking up while their brains are still partly dreaming. Many describe seeing figures standing in their rooms. That explanation makes sense. It would certainly explain why the experience felt so incredibly real. But at 11 years old, I had never heard of sleep paralysis. All I knew was that I had seen the exact same figure from my recurring nightmares standing in my bedroom. Whether my mind created it or not, the fear I felt was completely real. Years have passed since that night. I still live in the very same room where it happened. The furniture has changed over time, and I've grown older, but it's still the same room. Surprisingly, nothing like that has ever happened again. I've never seen the figure return. I've never had the recurring nightmare again. I've never woken up to another silent figure standing beside my bed. Whatever happened that night remains completely unique. Looking back now, I believe there are probably logical explanations. The human brain is capable of creating incredibly realistic experiences, especially when waking suddenly from sleep. Dreams can blend into reality. Sleep disorders can cause vivid hallucinations. Memory can also change slightly over time. I understand all of that. Even so, remembering those 5 minutes still gives me chills. Whether it was a nightmare that refused to end, a sleep-related hallucination, or something I'll never truly understand, it remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my childhood. Some memories fade with time. That one never has. Even now, if I wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, I sometimes find myself looking toward the same corner of the room for a brief second, half expecting to see that silent figure standing there again. Thankfully, I never have. Last summer, I experienced something that still doesn't make any sense to me. Even now, I replay those few moments in my mind, trying to figure out what actually happened. I've considered every logical explanation I can think of. Maybe I misheard something. Maybe my brain briefly interpreted random sounds as words. Maybe it was some strange auditory illusion. I honestly don't know. Whatever the explanation is, it felt completely real at the time, and it scared me more than almost anything I've ever experienced. It happened on what should have been a completely ordinary afternoon. I was standing at a train station waiting for my train to arrive. It wasn't unusually busy, but it wasn't empty either. There were people scattered all over the platform. Some were looking down at their phones, others were chatting with friends, while a few simply stared down the tracks, waiting for the train. Everything felt completely normal. I remember checking the digital display to make sure I was standing on the correct platform. The train was due to arrive within a minute or two, so I looked down the tracks and watched it approaching in the distance. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. People continued talking. The familiar sound of the train rolling closer echoed across the station. Announcements from other platforms occasionally played through the speakers. It was exactly the kind of ordinary afternoon you completely forget about by the end of the day. As the train slowed down and entered the station, something happened that I still can't explain. Without any warning, it felt like time itself had stopped. I know that sounds impossible, but it's honestly the closest description I have. 1 second, the station was full of life. people were talking. The train was making its usual screeching sound as it slowed down. Footsteps echoed across the platform. Then suddenly, everything disappeared. Not gradually. Instantly, every sound vanished at the same time. The conversations, the footsteps, the train, everything. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt unnatural. It was the kind of silence that immediately makes you realize something is wrong. For a moment, I simply stood there confused. I looked around the platform. The train was still there. The people were still standing where they had been only seconds earlier. Nothing looked different. Yet somehow, everything felt frozen. It was almost like the world had paused. Then I heard a voice. It sounded exactly like the automated announcement system that every train station uses. The voice was calm, professional, completely emotionless. It seemed to come through the station speakers, although I couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from. At first, I expected to hear something completely ordinary. Maybe the train's arrival. Maybe a platform change. Maybe a delay announcement. Instead, the voice said something that instantly made every drop of blood leave my body. I don't remember the exact wording anymore. It happened so quickly, and years have passed since then. But it was something very close to this. Nuclear annihilation is imminent. A nuclear missile has been launched in this direction. It will arrive here within the next few minutes. The actual announcement was longer than that. It sounded formal, detailed, almost like an official emergency broadcast. The wording was calm, almost disturbingly calm. There was no panic in the voice, no urgency. It simply delivered the information as if it were announcing the arrival of another train. For several seconds, my brain couldn't process what I'd just heard. Then suddenly, the meaning hit me. My heart immediately started pounding. I remember feeling an overwhelming wave of panic rush through my body. My first thought was simple. What am I supposed to do? If that announcement was real, there wasn't enough time. Where could anyone even go? How do you escape something like that? There wasn't time to drive anywhere. There wasn't time to call family. There wasn't time to find shelter. Every possible thought crashed into my head all at once. Should I run? Should I warn everyone around me? Should I get underneath something? Should I just accept what was about to happen? Nothing made sense. My mind couldn't settle on a single decision. Then I looked around. I expected complete chaos. Surely everyone else had heard exactly what I heard. People should have been screaming, running, calling loved ones, crying, doing something. Instead, nothing. Absolutely nothing. Everyone continued acting exactly the same as before. One man kept scrolling through his phone. A woman continued talking to the person beside her. Another passenger calmly adjusted their backpack. Nobody reacted. Nobody even looked surprised. It was as though the announcement had never happened. Then, just as suddenly as the silence had appeared, it vanished. The sounds of the station rushed back all at once. The train made noise again. People were talking. Doors opened. Footsteps echoed across the platform. The station instantly returned to normal. It honestly felt as though someone had pressed a pause button on reality for a few seconds before pressing play again. I just stood there, frozen, completely unable to understand what had happened. I kept looking from person to person. Surely someone else had noticed. Surely someone would ask whether anyone else had heard that announcement. Nobody did. No frightened expressions, no confused conversations, nothing. It felt like I was the only person who had experienced those terrifying few seconds. I stood there for about 20 seconds without moving. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it. I kept replaying the announcement over and over inside my head. Had I actually heard those words? Had I somehow imagined the entire thing? Could another announcement from a different platform have mixed together with other sounds? No explanation felt convincing. The message had sounded far too clear, far too specific, far too detailed. Eventually, the train doors opened fully and people calmly began boarding. After standing there in complete shock, I finally forced myself to move. I stepped onto the train with everyone else. I found a seat near the window, but I barely noticed anything around me. The entire ride passed in a blur. I wasn't paying attention to the scenery outside. I wasn't looking at my phone. I wasn't listening to conversations around me. I just kept replaying those few terrifying seconds again and again. The more I thought about it, the more frightened I became. Every time I remembered the announcement, my heart started racing all over again. Even after I reached my destination and got off the train, the panic refused to disappear. For several hours afterward, I felt physically shaken. My heartbeat stayed unusually fast. My hands felt slightly unsteady. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every now and then, a horrible thought would enter my mind. What if it was real? What if something was actually happening and nobody else realized it yet? Of course, nothing happened. The afternoon continued normally. People went about their lives. Cars drove past. Shops remained open. Everything carried on exactly as it always had. Gradually, the fear began fading. Once I finally calmed down, I started trying to explain what I'd experienced. Maybe I'd briefly entered some kind of dreamlike state while standing there. Maybe stress or exhaustion affected the way my brain processed sounds. Maybe I experienced an auditory hallucination. I've also read about people hearing words inside random background noise because the brain naturally tries to create recognizable patterns from unclear sounds. That honestly seems like one of the more reasonable explanations. The human brain is incredibly powerful. Sometimes it fills in missing information. Sometimes it creates words from meaningless sounds. Sometimes it convinces us we've experienced something that never actually happened. Logically, one of those explanations is probably correct. Even so, none of them fully capture how convincing the experience felt. During those few moments, I had absolutely no doubt that the announcement was real. The fear wasn't imagined. My panic wasn't imagined. My racing heartbeat wasn't imagined. My body reacted exactly as though I had just been told the world was about to end. Looking back now, I've occasionally joked that it almost felt as though I accidentally slipped into another timeline for a few seconds before reality corrected itself. Of course, I don't actually believe that happened. It's simply the closest comparison I can think of, because the experience felt so surreal. For those few seconds, the entire station seemed disconnected from reality. I heard something that nobody else appeared to notice. Then everything immediately returned to normal, as though nothing had happened. Whatever the true explanation was, I'll probably never know. I've never experienced anything even remotely similar before. Nothing like it has happened since. Even now, every time I stand on a train platform waiting for a train to arrive, I find myself paying just a little more attention whenever the station speakers switch on. Thankfully, every announcement I've heard since then has been completely ordinary. Platform changes, arrival times, minor delays, the usual everyday information. But for a few unforgettable my husband and I traveled to Kyoto a few years ago, and for the most part, the trip was exactly what we had hoped for. The city was beautiful, peaceful, and full of history. During the day, we spent hours exploring temples, wandering through narrow streets lined with traditional buildings, and trying foods we had never tasted before. By the time our third night arrived, we were completely exhausted from all the walking and sightseeing. That evening, We returned to our hotel much earlier than usual. We had originally planned to go out again after dinner, but the fatigue hit us harder than expected. Within a short time of getting back to our room, we both fell asleep. The room itself was simple but comfortable. It wasn't particularly large, and instead of one shared bed, there were two twin beds positioned side by side with a small space between them. The room felt perfectly normal when we went to sleep. There was nothing strange about it, nothing that made either of us uncomfortable. Sometime during the night, my husband suddenly woke up. At first, he wasn't sure what had disturbed him. The room was quiet, and everything seemed normal. Yet, he immediately had the strange feeling that someone else was there. Still half asleep, he assumed it was probably a member of the hotel staff. In some hotels, employees enter rooms in the evening to provide turn-down service, straighten the bedding, or leave fresh towels. Since we had fallen asleep so unusually early, he figured someone might have entered the room, noticed that we were asleep, and quietly left. But something about the situation felt wrong. As he lay there trying to wake up fully, he realized he had never heard the door close. The room was silent. If someone had entered and then left, surely he would have heard something. Even in his sleepy state, the sound of the door opening or shutting should have registered. The feeling that someone was nearby didn't go away. After a few moments, he sat up and looked around the room. Nothing. The dim outlines of the furniture were exactly where they should be. My bed was across from his. The curtains were drawn. The bathroom door was partially open. No one was there. He got out of bed and checked anyway. He looked behind the bathroom door. He glanced into every corner of the room. Finally, he opened the hotel room door and looked into the hallway outside. The corridor was empty. No footsteps, no staff members, no sounds. Nothing, eventually. He convinced himself that he must have imagined the entire thing. He returned to bed and fell asleep again, though the uneasy feeling lingered in the back of his mind. I knew none of this at the time because I remained asleep. Hours later, I woke up myself. The first thing I noticed was how strange I felt. Because we had gone to bed so early, I was completely disoriented. For a moment, I wasn't even sure what time it was. The room was dark, and there were no obvious sounds coming from outside. I wasn't fully awake, but I wasn't asleep either. I simply lay there staring into the darkness. At first, everything seemed normal. I could make out the faint shapes of furniture and the outline of the curtains near the window. My husband appeared to be sleeping peacefully in the bed beside mine. Then my eyes drifted toward the upper corner of the room. The top left corner looked darker than everything else. At first, I didn't think much of it. Rooms often contain shadows that seem unusual at night. Light from outside can create strange shapes, and tired eyes can play tricks on you. Still, something about that corner caught my attention. The darkness there seemed thicker somehow, deeper, almost solid. I continued staring at it. The longer I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. Then something happened that instantly erased any possibility that it was an ordinary shadow. It moved. I froze. The dark shape shifted ever so slightly, but enough that I knew I had seen it. My heart immediately started racing. I blinked several times and stared harder, trying to convince myself I was mistaken. Maybe my eyes were adjusting to the darkness. Maybe I had imagined it. But then it moved again. This time there was no doubt. The darkness seemed to peel away from the corner and slowly slide down the wall. I remember feeling a sudden wave of fear, unlike anything I had experienced before. It wasn't just fear. It felt wrong. There was an overwhelming sense that whatever I was looking at was not supposed to be there. As the black shape continued descending, I became aware of something else, an intense feeling of evil. To this day, I struggle to explain it properly. I wasn't seeing a person. I wasn't seeing a face. I wasn't even seeing a clearly defined figure. It was more like a moving mass of darkness. Yet somehow I felt absolutely convinced that it was aware of me. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Every instinct in my body was screaming that I was in danger. The darkness eventually reached the floor. Once it got lower, I could no longer see it clearly from my angle in bed. But somehow, that made everything worse. Now I didn't know where it was. I couldn't tell whether it had stopped moving or whether it was continuing toward me. Panic began taking over. I wanted to call out to my husband. I opened my mouth to speak. Nothing came out. At first I thought fear was preventing me from talking. Then I tried harder. Still nothing. No sound, not even a whisper. A surge of terror shot through me. I immediately tried to sit up. My body wouldn't move. I attempted to raise an arm. Nothing. I tried moving my legs. Nothing. I was completely frozen. My heart pounded violently in my chest. I could feel every beat. I was fully aware of my surroundings. I could think clearly. Yet my body refused to respond. The realization sent me into complete panic. I had never experienced anything like it before. I desperately tried to move again. Nothing happened. The harder I fought, the more trapped I felt. Meanwhile, that terrible presence remained in the room. Even though I couldn't see it clearly anymore, I could feel it. The sensation seemed to be getting closer. Every second that passed felt endless. I became convinced that whatever had emerged from that corner was moving toward my bed. The room suddenly felt much colder. The silence felt heavier. I could hear my own breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. Everything else seemed unnaturally still. Then I sensed movement near the foot of my bed. I couldn't see exactly what was happening, but I knew something was there. That feeling of evil intensified. It felt as though the darkness had crossed the floor and reached the end of my bed. I became absolutely certain that it was coming closer. At that point, fear completely overwhelmed me. I genuinely believed I was about to die. That sounds dramatic now, but in that moment it was exactly how I felt. I was trapped, unable to scream, unable to move, unable to wake my husband, and whatever was in the room seemed to be approaching me. I focused all of my energy on moving. Just one finger, one hand, anything, nothing worked. The presence continued feeling closer and closer. Then I became convinced it was about to touch me. Specifically, I felt certain it was reaching toward my feet beneath the blanket. The thought was so horrifying that something inside me suddenly snapped. In one explosive movement, my body responded. I threw the blankets off. I sat upright, and instantly everything changed. The paralysis disappeared. The pressure vanished. The overwhelming sense of evil was gone. Just gone. 1 second it had felt as though something terrifying was standing right beside me. The next second, the room was completely normal. I sat there breathing heavily, trying to understand what had happened. My hands were shaking. My heart was still racing. I looked around the room. Nothing. No movement. No dark figure. No strange shape in the corner. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Part of me wanted to turn on every light in the room. Another part of me was terrified to move. I didn't know what I might see. I considered waking my husband immediately. I considered getting out of bed and sitting in the bathroom with the lights on until morning. I even thought about climbing into his bed, despite how cramped it would have been. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I remained sitting there for a long time, trying to calm myself down. Eventually, my breathing slowed. My heartbeat returned to normal. The room continued looking completely ordinary. Little by little, exhaustion took over again. As strange as it sounds, I eventually lay back down and went back to sleep. Morning arrived much faster than I expected. Sunlight filled the room. The events of the night suddenly felt distant and unreal. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been some kind of vivid dream. Then my husband spoke. Before I could even tell him what had happened, he mentioned that he had experienced something strange during the night too. As we sat there getting ready for the day, we exchanged stories. He told me about waking up with the powerful feeling that someone was standing in the room. He described checking every corner, looking into the hallway, and finding absolutely nobody there. Then I told him about waking later, seeing the moving darkness, feeling unable to speak or move, and sensing that something evil had approached my bed. The room suddenly felt much quieter as we compared details. Neither of us knew what to make of it. Maybe it was all coincidence. Maybe my experience was some form of sleep paralysis. Maybe his strange feeling of a presence was unrelated. But the fact that both of us had independently experienced something unsettling in the same room, on the same night, left us deeply disturbed. Even now, years later, we still talk about that night in Kyoto. We've stayed in countless hotels since then, and never experienced anything remotely similar. Neither of us can explain exactly what happened. All we know is that on our third night in Kyoto, both of us woke up feeling as though we weren't alone in that room. And that memory has never completely left us. So there's an old historic tavern not far from where I grew up. During the American Revolutionary War, the building was used as both a tavern and a temporary hospital where wounded soldiers were treated. Because of its long history, people in the area had been telling ghost stories about it for as long as I could remember. Some said they heard strange voices at night. Others claimed they saw figures standing near the old building before disappearing into the darkness. Whether any of those stories were true or not, the place had a reputation that made people curious. When my friends and I were teenagers, we became obsessed with testing those stories for ourselves. Every few weeks, especially during the summer or around Halloween, we would drive over there late at night just to see if anything unusual would happen. We never expected to prove ghosts existed. We mostly went because it was exciting and because the atmosphere alone was enough to make your imagination run wild. The tavern sat by itself, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow every bit of light once the sun went down. Even before stepping onto the property, the place felt different from anywhere else. The old wooden building looked worn down by centuries of storms, and the silence around it always felt heavier than normal. There were no nearby houses, no traffic, and almost no sound except the wind moving through the trees. Every visit followed the same routine. We would park our cars, joke around to hide how nervous we actually were, then slowly walk around the property with our phone flashlights. We searched every corner, hoping something strange would happen, while secretly expecting nothing at all. For several trips, that was exactly what happened. Nothing. No mysterious voices. No ghostly figures. No unexplained noises. Every time we left, one of us would laugh and say the stories were obviously fake. Another would insist we just hadn't stayed long enough. Then, a few weeks later, we'd find ourselves coming back again. Eventually, we decided to give it one more visit before finally accepting that the place was probably just an old building with a creepy reputation. That night started exactly like every other visit. The air was cool, and the moon was mostly hidden behind clouds. The woods around the tavern were almost completely black, and our flashlights barely reached more than a few feet ahead of us. We wandered around the property for a while, talking quietly and trying not to scare each other with stupid jokes. Nothing happened. After nearly an hour, we gave up. We turned around and started walking back toward where we had entered the property. The tavern was now behind us, and the narrow path leading away from it stretched out in front of us. We were already talking about getting something to eat before heading home. Then, everything changed. Out of nowhere, a woman screamed. It wasn't a distant sound that could have come from somewhere in the woods. It sounded incredibly close, almost as if someone had been standing directly behind us. The scream was loud, sharp, and filled with pure terror. Every conversation stopped instantly. I froze where I was. For a second, nobody moved. I turned toward the friends walking beside me and asked, "Did you guys hear that?" None of them answered. They simply nodded. The look on their faces told me they had heard exactly what I had. Slowly, all four of us turned around. Standing in the middle of the path leading to the tavern was a woman. She wasn't there a second earlier. She simply appeared. She was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned white wedding dress. It wasn't bright or clean like a modern wedding gown. It looked aged, almost gray in the moonlight, hanging loosely around her body. Her long, dark hair completely covered her face. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking toward us. She wasn't making any sound. She was simply standing there in perfect silence, directly in the center of the path. Everything around us suddenly felt unnaturally still. The wind that had been moving through the trees seemed to disappear. The night became so quiet that it almost hurt. I kept waiting for someone to laugh and tell me it was a prank. Nobody did. I couldn't see her face. I couldn't even tell if she was looking at us. But the second I saw her, an overwhelming feeling crashed over me, unlike anything I have ever experienced before or since. It wasn't just fear. I've been scared plenty of times in my life. This was something completely different. It felt like every instinct inside my body was screaming one message: run, leave now. If you stay here, you're going to die. There wasn't any logical reason for me to think that. The woman wasn't charging toward us. She wasn't holding a weapon. She wasn't even moving. Yet every part of me believed with absolute certainty that staying where I was would end badly. The feeling was so powerful that I didn't stop to think. I turned around and ran. Not a cautious jog, not a quick walk. I sprinted as fast as I possibly could. Behind me, I heard my friends doing exactly the same thing. None of us yelled. None of us looked back. Our footsteps pounded against the pavement as we ran away from the tavern and through the quiet streets. We ran several blocks without slowing down, completely driven by panic. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were giving out, but none of us wanted to be the first person to stop. Eventually, we reached the parking area where we had left our cars. Without saying a single word, each of us rushed into our own vehicle. Doors slammed shut almost simultaneously. Engines started immediately. It felt like everyone wanted to get as much distance between themselves and that place as possible before speaking. As I drove away, my heart was still pounding. I kept trying to convince myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone had wandered onto the property. Maybe it had been someone wearing a costume. Maybe the darkness had tricked my brain after hearing the scream. The human mind is incredibly good at filling in missing details, especially when it's frightened. I wanted to believe that was all it was. By the time we stopped a few miles away, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the entire thing. Memory isn't perfect. People misinterpret things all the time. Maybe I had only seen a shadow. Maybe fear had turned that shadow into something else. I desperately wanted one of those explanations to be true. The four of us got out of our cars. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Everyone looked shaken. Finally, I decided to test my own memory. Instead of describing what I had seen, I asked one of my friends a simple question. "What did you see back there?" I didn't want to accidentally influence his answer. He looked at me for a moment before quietly saying, "A woman standing on the path." I felt a chill run through me. I asked him to describe her. He said she was wearing a wedding dress. Her hair was hanging over her face. She wasn't moving. Every detail matched exactly what I remembered. Still hoping it was some kind of coincidence, I turned to the other two friends and asked them separately. Neither of them had heard the other's answer. Both described the same thing. A woman, a wedding dress, long hair covering her face, standing silently in the middle of the path. None of us had spoken during the run back to the cars. None of us had compared stories before that moment. Yet every description matched almost perfectly. That realization scared me more than anything we'd seen that night. If only I had seen her, I could have blamed stress, darkness, or my imagination. If two of us had seen her, maybe one person had influenced the other without realizing it. But all four of us described the same figure independently. To this day, I still search for a logical explanation. I've considered every possibility I can think of. Maybe there really was someone standing there. Maybe the darkness distorted what we saw. Maybe our brains all made the same mistake at exactly the same moment. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the feeling I experienced that night has never happened before or since. I've never felt such immediate, overwhelming certainty that I needed to leave a place without hesitation. That instinct was stronger than panic. It was stronger than reason. It felt ancient, almost as if some part of my brain recognized danger before I consciously understood it. Whatever stood on that path, real or imagined, changed the way I think about places with long histories. Some buildings carry centuries of memories, tragedies, and stories that seem to linger long after the people are gone. Maybe that's all this was. Or maybe it was something we simply don't have an explanation for. I never returned to that tavern after that night. People still tell stories about it, and every now and then someone asks if I want to go back and see whether anything else happens. My answer is always the same. No, I don't need another experience to convince me that something happened out there. Whether it was paranormal, psychological, or something I'll never fully understand, one night was enough. Some memories stay with you forever. That silent woman standing in the middle of the path is one of them. I was around 12 or 13 years old when it happened. It was the middle of summer, and I was home alone for the afternoon. My parents had gone out, and the house was completely quiet, except for the sound of the television in the living room. Like most kids my age, I was enjoying having the place to myself. I had turned on some cartoons, grabbed my Game Boy, and settled into my favorite spot to relax. In our living room, we had recently bought a brand new recliner. It was one of those large, overstuffed La-Z-Boy-style chairs that felt incredibly comfortable. It was soft enough that you could easily fall asleep in it, and since it was still fairly new, everyone in the family wanted to sit in it whenever they had the chance. That afternoon, I had claimed it for myself. I remember sitting in the chair with one leg hanging casually over the left armrest while my Game Boy rested in my hands. The television was on in the background, playing cartoons I wasn't paying much attention to because I was focused on my game. Every now and then I would gently rock the recliner back and forth, not enough to make it slam or tip. Just the slow, relaxing movement people naturally make when they're sitting in one of those chairs. Everything felt completely normal. Outside, it was a hot summer day. I don't remember the exact temperature, but I do remember that our air conditioner had been giving us problems for days. I'm almost certain it wasn't working properly at the time. The house felt warm, and there certainly wasn't any cold air blowing through the vents. That's why what happened next has always stayed with me. Without any warning, I felt a chill. It wasn't the kind of cool breeze you notice when someone opens a door. It wasn't the slight temperature change you feel when a cloud covers the sun. It was an intense wave of cold that seemed to come from nowhere. One second I was warm. The next, It felt as though the temperature around me had dropped dramatically. The cold seemed to wash over my entire body in an instant. Every hair on my arms stood up, and I remember feeling an overwhelming sense that something wasn't right. Even today, years later, I still have trouble explaining exactly what that feeling was. It wasn't just physical. There was something deeply unsettling about it. The room suddenly felt wrong. I looked up from my Game Boy for just a moment, trying to figure out where the cold had come from. Nothing looked unusual. The television was still playing. The curtains weren't moving. There weren't any open windows. The house was completely silent. Then, before I had time to think about it, everything happened at once. Without warning, I was violently thrown forward out of the recliner. It wasn't like I simply lost my balance. It felt as though something had suddenly forced the chair forward with incredible strength. The entire recliner pitched toward the floor. Before I even understood what was happening, I was no longer sitting in it. I hit the floor hard. A split second later, the chair came crashing down on top of me. For a moment, I just lay there underneath it, completely stunned. I wasn't seriously hurt, but I was shocked. The whole thing had happened so fast that my brain struggled to catch up. I pushed the heavy chair off myself and slowly stood up, trying to understand what had just happened. The living room looked exactly the same as it had a few seconds earlier. Nothing else had fallen over. Nothing else had moved. The television kept playing as if nothing had happened. I stared at the recliner for a long time. It was lying face down on the floor, something I had never seen before. At first, I immediately searched for a logical explanation. I assumed the chair must have malfunctioned. Since it was still fairly new, maybe something inside the reclining mechanism had broken. Maybe the rocking motion had somehow caused it to lock incorrectly before suddenly giving way. That explanation made sense. At least, it made more sense than anything else. The only problem was that I hadn't been rocking aggressively. I wasn't bouncing around in it. I wasn't leaning dangerously far back. I had only been moving gently, the same way anyone naturally rocks in a recliner while relaxing. Nothing about what I was doing should have caused the entire chair to launch forward. Still, I convinced myself it had to be mechanical. I didn't tell many people about it because I figured everyone would simply assume I had tipped it over myself. Maybe I had. Maybe I shifted my weight without realizing it. Maybe I accidentally pushed too hard with one foot. Those explanations sounded reasonable enough. But deep down, something about the experience never sat right with me. More than the chair falling, I couldn't forget that sudden wave of freezing cold. The chill had happened first, then the chair. The two memories became permanently connected in my mind. Whether they were actually related or not, I couldn't separate them afterward. For years I avoided sitting in that recliner. Even after it was stood back up and seemed perfectly normal again, I never trusted it. Whenever someone else sat in it, nothing happened. It worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Nobody else ever complained about it. There were no more accidents, no sudden failures, no mysterious tipping. As far as everyone else was concerned, it was just another chair. But every time I walked past it, I remembered lying underneath it after being thrown onto the floor. Eventually, my family noticed that I always chose a different seat whenever we were watching television. Nobody really questioned it. I never felt like explaining why. As the years passed, I slowly stopped thinking about that afternoon quite so often. Life moved on. I got older. We eventually replaced furniture. The recliner disappeared from the house, but the memory never completely left me. Although nothing physical like that has ever happened again, I have experienced something else from time to time that reminds me of that day. Every once in a while, usually when I'm completely alone, I'll suddenly get the unmistakable feeling that someone else is in the room with me. It's difficult to describe because I never actually see anyone. I never hear footsteps. I never hear voices. Nothing moves. There isn't any obvious sign that another person is nearby. It's simply a feeling, an incredibly strong one. It's the sensation that someone is standing just outside my field of vision, quietly watching me. Most people have probably experienced something similar at least once in their lives. You look over your shoulder for no reason. You suddenly become aware of how quiet the room is. You can't shake the feeling that you're not actually alone. Usually, when that happens, I immediately look around. Every single time, there's nobody there. Even so, the feeling can be so intense that it makes me leave the room anyway. I've experienced that sensation several times over the years. It's always unsettling, but it has never escalated beyond that. I've never seen a figure. I've never heard unexplained voices. I've never watched objects move on their own. And I've certainly never experienced another physical event as dramatic as what happened with that recliner. That's what makes that childhood memory stand apart from everything else. I've spent years trying to explain it logically. Maybe I really did lose my balance. Maybe the chair had a defect that somehow corrected itself afterward. Maybe I shifted my weight at exactly the wrong moment. Human memory isn't perfect, especially memories from childhood. I know that. I've considered every ordinary explanation I can think of. And honestly, one of those explanations may very well be correct. But no matter how many logical possibilities I come up with, there's one part I can never fully explain. That wave of icy cold. I can still remember exactly how it felt. The room had been warm all afternoon. The air conditioner wasn't working properly. There shouldn't have been any sudden drop in temperature. Yet I remember that freezing sensation as clearly as I remember the chair falling. Maybe the two events were completely unrelated. Maybe the cold was just a coincidence. Maybe my memory combined them over the years because they happened within seconds of each other. I can't say for certain. All I know is that, in the moment, it felt like the cold arrived first, and everything else followed immediately afterward. Even now, whenever someone tells a story about an unexplained experience, I usually look for the practical explanation first. I don't immediately jump to the supernatural. Most strange events eventually turn out to have perfectly ordinary causes. That's probably true for my experience too. But every once in a while, I'll remember that quiet summer afternoon. I remember sitting alone, playing my Game Boy, absent-mindedly rocking in a brand new recliner while cartoons played in the background. I remember the house being warm. I remember that impossible wave of freezing cold. And I remember being thrown onto the floor as the chair crashed down on top of me. Whether it was a faulty piece of furniture, an incredibly strange coincidence, or something I'll never truly understand, it's still the most unsettling thing that's ever happened to me. Nothing before it has ever matched it. And thankfully, nothing since then ever has. Many years ago, on my way to work, I got a flat tire. But something told me to drive to the nearest town. As a result, the wheel became completely unusable. While I was changing a tire, a car stopped next to me, and some guy asked how to get to the city, even though there were signs everywhere. It was summer, but he was wearing huge winter work gloves, and he kept trying to come up to me, but I tried to stand so that my car was between us and kept the spanner ready to throw at him. I told him that we needed to go straight ahead, and it was clear that he couldn't think of anything else to ask, and there were already a lot of people on the street, 6 a.m., and he just left. It's good that I stopped in a fairly crowded place. Later I found out that there was a gang operating in those areas that damaged tires and then killed drivers. There were even a few episodes on TV. As far as I can tell, he needed this glove to hide the gun. Always trust your intuition and don't stop in deserted places. When my relatives and I were watching a TV program about this gang, I said that I saw this guy They laughed and didn't believe me. I'm serious. You just imagined it. This couldn't happen to you. Many years ago, I was driving to work early one morning when something happened that at first seemed like nothing more than bad luck. Looking back now, I'm convinced it could have ended very differently. It was around 6 o'clock in the morning during the summer. The sun had already started to rise, and there were a few people out beginning their day. Roads weren't completely empty, but they also weren't busy enough to make you feel surrounded by other drivers. As I was driving, I suddenly felt my car pulling slightly to one side. Within seconds, I realized I had a flat tire. My first instinct was to pull over immediately and change it. That's what most people would do. But for some reason, I hesitated. I can't explain why. There wasn't anything unusual about the road. I didn't see anyone following me. Nothing looked suspicious. Still, I had this overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't stop where I was. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was simply a quiet voice in the back of my mind telling me to keep driving. So I did. I continued toward the nearest town instead of stopping on the side of the road. I knew driving on a flat tire would probably destroy the wheel, but at that moment, damaging the rim somehow felt like the better option. By the time I reached the edge of town, the tire was completely ruined. The wheel had taken a beating, and I knew it would need to be replaced instead of repaired. Even so, I felt relieved that I had made it somewhere with other people around. I found a place to pull over where there were already a few cars passing by and several businesses beginning to open for the day. Workers were arriving, pedestrians were walking along the sidewalks, and there was enough activity that I didn't feel completely isolated. I got out of my car, opened the trunk, and took out the spare tire and the tools I needed. Changing a tire isn't difficult, but it does leave you vulnerable. You're focused on the wheel. Your hands are occupied. You aren't paying full attention to everything happening around you. As I started loosening the lug nuts, another car slowly pulled over nearby. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's common for people to stop and offer help when they see someone stranded with car trouble. The driver got out and walked toward me. He seemed calm enough, and for a brief moment I thought he was simply going to ask if I needed assistance. Instead, he asked me how to get to the city. The question immediately felt strange. We were already on a main road. There were road signs everywhere pointing toward the city. Anyone paying even a little attention would have had no trouble figuring out where to go. His question didn't make much sense. I gave him simple directions anyway. Just keep going straight. Normally, that would have been the end of the conversation. But instead of thanking me and leaving, he continued moving closer. That's when I noticed something else. It was the middle of summer. The weather was warm enough that most people were wearing short sleeves. But this man was wearing enormous heavy-duty winter work gloves. Not thin driving gloves, not lightweight gardening gloves. Thick gloves that looked completely out of place for the season. The sight immediately made me uncomfortable. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe he had been working somewhere. Maybe he simply preferred wearing them. But combined with his unnecessary question, something about him felt wrong. As he stepped closer, every instinct I had told me not to let him get within arm's reach. I quietly adjusted my position so that my car stayed between us. If he moved to one side, I moved with him. I kept the vehicle acting as a barrier. At the same time, I picked up the wheel wrench. I wasn't planning to attack anyone, but I held it firmly, ready to throw it or defend myself if I absolutely had to. The man kept looking at me as though he was trying to think of another reason to continue the conversation. There was an awkward silence. He had already asked for directions. I'd already answered. There wasn't really anything else to say. For several uncomfortable seconds, he just stood there. It felt like he was waiting for something. Maybe he wanted me to move away from the car. Maybe he was hoping I'd lower my guard. Maybe I'm wrong. I honestly don't know. But I remember thinking that his behavior simply didn't make sense. By that point, more people had started appearing nearby. Cars were driving past. Workers were walking toward nearby buildings. The streets were becoming busier as the morning rush slowly began. Whatever his intentions were, he seemed to notice that too. After another moment of hesitation, he finally turned around, got back into his car, and drove away without another word. The entire encounter probably lasted only a few minutes. Once he disappeared, I finished changing my tire as quickly as I could and continued to work. For a while, I convinced myself I had simply met an odd stranger. People ask strange questions all the time. Some people behave awkwardly. Maybe that was all it had been. Life moved on, and I didn't think much about it. Then, sometime later, I saw something on television that completely changed the way I looked at that morning. A news program was covering a criminal gang that had been operating throughout that region. According to investigators, the group targeted drivers on quiet roads. In some cases, they intentionally damaged vehicles or waited for drivers who had flat tires. Once someone stopped in an isolated location, members of the gang would approach under various excuses before robbing or murdering the driver. Several cases had already been connected to them. The crimes had become serious enough that television programs were warning the public about the danger. As I watched the report, I immediately thought back to the man who had approached me. Everything about the encounter suddenly felt different. The unnecessary question. The way he kept trying to move closer. The heavy gloves on a hot summer morning. I remembered wondering why anyone would wear thick winter work gloves in that kind of weather. After hearing investigators discuss how some criminals concealed weapons while approaching victims, one thought immediately crossed my mind. Maybe those gloves weren't for warmth at all. Maybe they were being used to hide something. Perhaps a firearm. Perhaps something else entirely. Of course, I can't prove that. I never actually saw a weapon. I never saw him threaten me. It's entirely possible that my mind connected unrelated details after learning about the gang. Memory has a way of doing that. Even so, I can't ignore how uncomfortable I felt before I knew any of that information. The warning feeling came first, long before I heard about the gang, long before I saw the television report. Something about that man simply didn't feel right. I had trusted that instinct without fully understanding why. Looking back, I'm grateful I did. If I had stopped on an empty stretch of road instead of driving into town, I often wonder whether the encounter would have been different. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe he would never have appeared. Or maybe there wouldn't have been other people nearby to interrupt whatever he had planned. I'll never know. One thing I do know is that being in a populated area made all the difference. By 6 a.m, enough people were already outside that anyone thinking about committing a crime would have had to reconsider. The presence of witnesses changes everything. Later, I told several relatives about what had happened after we watched the television program together. I expected them to be surprised. Instead, they laughed. They thought I was exaggerating. One of them smiled and said I must have imagined it. Another insisted there was no way something like that could have happened to me. You probably just got nervous because you had a flat tire. You've convinced yourself it was the same guy. You were imagining things. I tried to explain that I wasn't making it up. I told them how strange the conversation had been. I described the gloves. I explained how he kept trying to move closer while I deliberately kept my car between us. I even admitted that I couldn't prove he was part of the gang, but I also couldn't ignore how every instinct I had was telling me to stay alert. They still didn't believe me. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince them. After all, I couldn't identify the man. I didn't have photographs. I had no evidence beyond my own memory. From their perspective, it sounded like an ordinary roadside encounter that I'd connected to a news story afterward. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was nothing more than an uncomfortable coincidence. But when I think back on that morning, one detail stands above everything else. Before I knew there was a gang, before I saw any television reports, before anyone warned me about criminals operating in that area, something inside me told me not to stop on that lonely road. That decision cost me a wheel, but replacing a wheel is far cheaper than risking your life. Whether it was intuition, luck, or simple caution, I still believe listening to that feeling was one of the smartest decisions I've ever made. Since then, I've always followed one simple rule whenever something goes wrong while I'm driving. If I have any choice at all, I keep moving until I reach a place where other people are around. A damaged tire can be replaced. A ruined wheel can be repaired. But some mistakes don't give you a second chance. If an unexplained feeling tells you something isn't right, it's worth paying attention. You may never know why you felt that way, but sometimes trusting your instincts is the reason you make it home safely. There's an old historic tavern not far from where I live, and it has a reputation that almost everyone in the area knows about. The building dates back to the American Revolutionary War, and according to local history, it wasn't just a tavern. During the war, it was also used as a temporary hospital where wounded soldiers were brought for treatment. Over the years, countless stories began to surround the place. Some people claimed they heard strange voices after dark, while others insisted they had seen figures wandering around the property late at night. Whether those stories were true or not, the tavern earned a reputation as one of the most haunted places in the area. When my friends and I were teenagers, we were fascinated by anything mysterious. Ghost stories, abandoned buildings, and local legends were exactly the kind of things that made an ordinary weekend feel exciting. Every now and then, especially during summer break, we would drive over to the tavern after dark just to see if any of the rumors were true. The building sat by itself, surrounded by thick woods that stretched out in every direction. Even during the day, it had an eerie feeling, but at night, it became something completely different. The old wooden walls looked darker under the moonlight, the trees blocked most of the light, and the silence made every little sound seem much louder than it really was. Still, we never went there expecting to see a ghost. We mostly thought it would be fun to scare ourselves. Every visit followed the same pattern. We would park nearby, joke around to hide the fact that we were all a little nervous, then slowly walk around the property with our phone flashlights. We would shine the lights through old windows, walk along the paths around the building, and listen carefully for anything unusual. Nothing ever happened. No voices, no footsteps, no mysterious figures, no unexplained lights. After several trips, we started believing the stories were nothing more than local legends that had grown over time. Eventually, we decided to visit one last time. The plan was simple. We would spend a little while walking around the property, and if nothing happened again, we'd finally accept that the haunted reputation was probably exaggerated. That night felt different from the beginning. The air was calm, and the woods were unusually quiet. Normally, you could hear insects, birds, or animals moving through the trees, but that evening everything seemed strangely still. Even though none of us mentioned it, I think we all noticed how unusually silent the place felt. We wandered around the tavern for nearly an hour. Once again, absolutely nothing happened. Eventually, we laughed at ourselves for wasting another evening chasing ghost stories. We decided it was time to leave. The four of us turned around and started walking away from the building. At that point, the tavern was behind us, and the narrow dirt path leading away from the property stretched out in front of us. We were already talking about getting something to eat before heading home. Then, without any warning, everything changed. A woman screamed. The sound came from somewhere behind us. It wasn't faint. It wasn't distant. It sounded incredibly close, almost as if someone had screamed from only a few yards away. It was a sharp, terrified scream that echoed through the quiet woods before everything fell silent again. Every conversation stopped instantly. All four of us froze. For a second, nobody moved. I looked at the friend walking beside me and quietly asked, "Did you hear that?" He didn't answer. He simply nodded. The others did the same. None of us spoke another word. Slowly, we turned around. Standing in the middle of the path leading toward the tavern was a woman. She hadn't been there just moments earlier. She was simply standing there. She wore what looked like an old-fashioned wedding dress. The dress wasn't bright white like a modern wedding gown. In the dim light, it looked faded and almost gray, hanging loosely around her body as if it had been there for years. The most disturbing part was her face, or rather, the fact that we couldn't see it. Her long, dark hair hung completely over her face, hiding every feature. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking toward us. She wasn't making another sound. She was simply standing perfectly still in the center of the path. The silence around us became overwhelming. The woods felt completely lifeless. Even the breeze seemed to disappear. I kept waiting for someone to laugh and tell me it was another group of teenagers trying to scare visitors. Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything. The woman never moved. I couldn't explain what happened next because I've never experienced anything like it before or since. The second I looked at her, an overwhelming feeling hit me. It wasn't ordinary fear. I've been scared plenty of times in my life. This felt completely different. It was an intense, uncontrollable feeling of absolute dread. Every instinct inside me was screaming the same message. Leave, run, get away right now. There was no logical reason for me to feel that way. The woman hadn't threatened us, she wasn't chasing us, she wasn't even moving. But somehow, I became completely convinced that if I stayed there for even another second, something terrible would happen. It felt like certain death. I can't explain why. I simply knew I had to leave. Without saying a word, I turned around and started running. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I possibly could. Almost immediately, I heard my friends running beside me. None of us told the others to run. Nobody shouted. Nobody questioned what was happening. Each of us reacted exactly the same way. We sprinted away from the tavern as fast as our legs could carry us. We ran several blocks without slowing down. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. My lungs burned from running, but I never considered stopping. The only thing on my mind was putting as much distance as possible between us and whatever we had just seen. Eventually, we reached the small parking area where our cars were waiting. Still without speaking, we rushed to our vehicles. Car doors slammed shut almost at the same time. Engines started immediately. Within seconds, all four of us were driving away. Even after leaving, none of us pulled over right away. It was as if we all wanted to get far away from that place before saying anything. As I drove, I tried desperately to convince myself that my mind had played a trick on me. Maybe hearing the scream had caused my imagination to fill in the rest. The human brain is powerful, especially when you're already in a place that's supposed to be haunted. Maybe I had expected to see something frightening, so my brain created an image to match the sound. The more I thought about it, the more I wanted that explanation to be true. Memory isn't perfect. People misunderstand things all the time. Darkness can easily distort what you think you're seeing. By the time we finally stopped a few miles away, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I decided not to tell anyone what I thought I had seen. Instead, I wanted to see whether my memory matched anyone else's. I turned to one of my friends and asked a simple question. "What did you see back there?" I didn't mention a woman. I didn't mention a wedding dress. I didn't describe anything at all. I wanted his answer to be completely independent. He looked at me for a moment before quietly replying, "There was a woman standing on the path." A chill ran through my body. I asked him to describe her. He said she was wearing a wedding dress. He said her hair completely covered her face. He said she never moved. Every detail matched exactly what I remembered. Still hoping it was somehow a coincidence, I waited until we met up with the other two friends. I asked them the same question separately, making sure they couldn't hear each other's answers. Once again, I didn't describe what I had seen. I simply asked what they saw. Both of them gave almost identical descriptions. A woman. A wedding dress. Long hair hanging over her face. Standing silently in the middle of the path. None of us had talked while we were running. None of us had compared stories before then. Yet every description matched. That realization frightened me far more than seeing the figure itself. If only I had seen her, I could easily blame stress, darkness, or my imagination. If two of us had seen her, maybe one person had accidentally influenced the other. But all four of us independently described the exact same woman. To this day, I still search for a logical explanation. Maybe someone was standing on the property wearing old clothing. Maybe there was an elaborate prank taking place that night. Maybe our brains all interpreted the same shadow in the same way after hearing the scream. I honestly don't know. I've gone over every possibility countless times. No explanation has ever completely satisfied me. What I remember most clearly isn't even the woman herself. It's the feeling. I've never experienced that overwhelming sense of danger before or since. It wasn't normal fear. It felt like every survival instinct I had was telling me that staying there would be a terrible mistake. That feeling alone was enough to make me run without asking questions. Years have passed since that night. The tavern is still there. People still tell stories about it. Friends occasionally ask if I'd ever go back to see whether anything else happens. My answer has never changed. No, one visit was enough. Whether what we saw was paranormal, an incredible coincidence, or something we'll never be able to explain, I have no interest in finding out. Some experiences stay with you for the rest of your life. That silent woman standing in the middle of the path is one of those memories. Even now, whenever I think back to that night, I can still picture her exactly as we all described her, standing perfectly still, wearing an old wedding dress, her face completely hidden behind her hair, waiting in absolute silence.